message arrived during the War Council, and Queen Zalara nearly incinerated the messenger for the interruption. Her generals were debating the next phase of the human conflict, mapping out invasion routes through the outer colonies, when the young attendant entered the obsidian chamber with trembling claws. The holographic displays flickered as Zalara turned her 6 eyes toward him, her crest flaring crimson with displeasure. "This had better justify your continued existence," she said, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones that made lesser beings prostrate themselves. The attendant held out a data tablet, his scales pale with fear. "Majesty, a message from the human ambassador. She requests a private audience with you." General Kavros, his scarred hide bearing the marks of 100 campaigns, released a low growl. "The humans dare to request an audience while their fleets burn our forward positions? This is an insult." Zalara took the tablet, her claws clicking against its surface as she read. Then she read it again, certain she had misunderstood. Her crest shifted from crimson to a shocked silver. "She wants me to share a meal with her." The chamber fell silent. Even the holographic displays seemed to pause in their tactical rotations. Sharing food was the most intimate act in Kyrath culture, reserved for blood family and the closest of bond mates. To invite an outsider, especially an alien, especially an enemy, to break bread was unthinkable. It was either profound ignorance or calculated provocation. "It's a trap, obviously," Kavros said. "The humans are known for their deception. They want to poison you or assassinate you during a vulnerable moment." But Zalara felt something else beneath the words on the screen. There was a directness to the invitation, a simplicity that didn't match the elaborate psychological warfare the humans typically employed. Ambassador Helen Torres had written the message herself, not through diplomatic channels or official protocols. The language was plain, almost casual. "Your Majesty, I know this request might seem strange, but I'd like to cook you dinner. Just the 2 of us. No guards, no staff, no agendas. Just 2 people sharing a meal and honest conversation. I think we need this more than another battle." Zalara dismissed the council over their loud objections. Alone in her private chambers, she stared at the message for hours, her mind turning over every possible angle. The Kyrath Empire had been expanding for 3 centuries, absorbing or destroying everything in its path. The humans were the first species to halt that expansion, to fight them to a standstill despite inferior numbers and technology. They were unpredictable, creative, and somehow able to turn every defeat into a lesson that made them stronger. And now their ambassador wanted to cook her dinner. Against every instinct, against the advice of every advisor. Zalara sent her response. She would accept the invitation. If it was a trap, she would survive it. She had survived worse, but if it was something else, something her empire desperately needed, even if they didn't know it yet, she had to find out. The human embassy on the neutral station of Crosspoint Prime was surprisingly modest. Zalara had expected grandeur, power displays, the kind of intimidation tactic she would have employed. Instead, she found herself being led through simple corridors to a small residential wing. Her security team had insisted on sweeping the location 3 times. They found nothing suspicious, which somehow made everyone more nervous. Helen Torres waited at the door of her personal quarters, and Zalara studied her carefully. The human was smaller than most of her species, with dark skin and gray-streaked hair pulled back in a simple style. She wore civilian clothes, not a uniform or formal attire. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of age and stress, but her smile seemed genuine as she extended her hand in the human greeting gesture. "Your Majesty, thank you for coming. I know this is unusual." Zalara's translator rendered the words in flat Kyrath, stripping away whatever emotional nuances existed in the human's tone. She examined the offered hand for a moment, before carefully taking it, mimicking the brief grip and release she'd seen in intelligence briefings. "Ambassador Torres, I confess, I am uncertain what to expect from this encounter." Helen's smile widened. "Honestly, so am I. But please, come in, and call me Helen. I think titles are part of what's keeping us at war." The interior of Helen's quarters was even more unexpected. Books lined the walls, actual physical books made of paper, a luxury in space. Photographs hung in simple frames, showing people Zalara assumed were family and friends, and the smell, strange, but not unpleasant, filled the air. Something was cooking. "I hope you're hungry," Helen said, leading her to a small kitchen area where pots bubbled on a heating unit. "I'm making some dishes from Earth. Nothing fancy, just food that means something to me." Zalara watched as Helen moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, stirring, tasting, adjusting. There were no servants, no staff. The ambassador was preparing the meal herself, and the intimacy of that act sent a shock through Zalara's system. This was either the most elaborate manipulation she'd ever encountered, or something far more dangerous, something genuine. "You cook for yourself?" Zalara asked, unable to hide her surprise. Helen laughed, a warm sound that seemed out of place in a galaxy at war. "Always have. My grandmother taught me. She said that cooking for someone is an act of love, and the world needs more love, not less." She gestured to a chair at a small table set for two. "Please sit." "Ha ha 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 ha. We have about 15 minutes until everything's ready. Can I get you something to drink?" Zalara settled into the chair, her larger frame making the human furniture seem fragile. She accepted a glass of water, noting that Helen poured from the same container she drank from herself. No poison, then, unless the human was willing to die as well. The thought was oddly comforting. "I must admit," Zalara said, "I expected this to be more adversarial, some kind of negotiation tactic." Helen turned from the stove, her expression thoughtful. "I've been a diplomat for 20 years, Your Majesty. I've sat through 1,000 negotiations, used every tactic in the book, and you know what I've learned? The tactics don't work when both sides are too afraid to be honest with each other." She returned to her cooking, but continued speaking. "My son died in the Battle of Proxima Station. He was a pilot, 23 years old, full of life and dreams. The Kyrath destroyed his carrier before he even got his fighter launched." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. Zalara felt her crest lower, a gesture of respect for the dead that crossed species lines. "I am sorry for your loss," she said, and meant it. "So am I," Helen said quietly. "And I'm sorry for all the Kyrath who died there too. And I'm sorry for every battle since. We've been killing each other for 5 years now, and for what? Territory? Pride? Because neither side knows how to stop?" She began plating the food, her movements slower now, weighted with grief. "After my son died, I could have asked for a combat posting. God knows they needed experienced officers. But I chose this instead, because someone has to try to end it. And I couldn't bear the thought of another mother, human or Kyrath, losing her child." Zalara watched as Helen set 2 plates on the table. The food was simple, rice and vegetables and some kind of protein in a savory sauce, but the care in the presentation was evident. Helen sat down across from her and met her eyes directly. "So this isn't a tactic, Your Majesty. This is me, tired and grieving, and desperate for peace, asking you to share a meal with me. Not as enemies, just as 2 people who are tired of the dying." Zalara looked at the food, at the human across from her, at the simple honesty in those weathered eyes. She thought of her own losses, the weight of command, the endless cycles of conquest that had defined her reign. And slowly, carefully, she picked up the human eating utensils and took her first bite. The food was good, simple, honest, made with care. And as the flavors filled her mouth, something inside Zalara's chest, something she'd kept locked and armored for decades, began to crack. They ate in silence for a while, and Zala found herself savoring not just the food, but the quiet companionship. No one demanded anything of her here. No generals pushing for more aggression, no councils questioning her strength, no endless weight of empire pressing down on her shoulders. Just a meal, shared between 2 beings trying to find their way through darkness. "This is remarkable," Zalara said finally. "What is it called?" Helen smiled. "My grandmother called it her everything stew. She made it from whatever we had on hand when times were tough. It's not elegant, but it's sustaining. It kept us alive through some hard years. Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. She survived the African famines of the 2040s, emigrated to North America, raised 6 children in poverty, and somehow taught them all to lead with love instead of anger. Helen's eyes grew distant with memory. She used to say that sharing food is sharing life. Matt, we're all just trying to survive, and survival is easier when we help each other. Zalara set down her utensils carefully. The Kyrath have a similar belief, though we've forgotten it over the centuries of expansion. Our ancient texts speak of the first meal, when the warring tribes came together and realized that breaking bread together was the first step toward breaking the cycle of violence. But you don't share meals with outsiders anymore. No, we don't. Zalara felt the weight of that admission. The Empire grew strong through conquest. We saw kindness as weakness, cooperation as vulnerability. We forgot that our ancestors built their first civilization not through domination, but through sharing what they had. Helen reached across the table, not quite touching, but close enough that the gesture carried meaning. I think we've both forgotten a lot of important things. Humans aren't innocent in this war. We could have tried harder to find common ground when our people first met. Instead, we saw your strength and felt threatened. We armed ourselves and drew lines in space. And we saw your rapid expansion and felt challenged. Zalara continued. We struck first because we assumed you would eventually strike us, fear breeding fear until war seemed inevitable. Was it though? Helen asked softly. Inevitable? Zalara thought about that as she took another bite of the simple, honest food. She thought about the War Council, the endless campaigns, the worlds burning under Kyrath occupation. She thought about her people, exhausted and strained, maintaining an empire that brought them glory but cost them everything that made glory worth having. No, she said finally. I don't think it was. I think we made choices, both of us, that led us here, and I think we can make different choices. Helen's expression shifted, hope and fear mixing in her eyes. Can we? Your empire has been expanding for 300 years. Can you really change that course? And even if you could, would your people follow you? I don't know, Zalara admitted, and the honesty of it was terrifying and freeing at the same time. My military council would call this treason. They believe in strength through conquest, in the manifest destiny of Kyrath supremacy. If I proposed peace now, they might overthrow me, and my government would accuse me of weakness, Helen said. We've spent enormous resources on this war. Entire industries have been built around it. There are humans who profit from the conflict, who would fight to keep it going. They looked at each other across the table. 2 leaders trapped by the systems they were supposed to command, and Zalara felt a kinship she'd never expected to find with an alien, with an enemy, with anyone. So what do we do? Zalara asked. Helen stood and moved to a window that looked out over the station's central plaza. Ships from a dozen species moved through the docking lanes, commerce and life continuing despite the war raging in distant sectors. I've been thinking about that a lot, she said, and I keep coming back to this. We can't end the war by having one side defeat the other. Even if humanity somehow won, we'd be fighting Kyrath insurgents for generations. And if the Kyrath win, you'd be occupying a human population that would never stop resisting. Perpetual conflict, Zalara said. Yes, my strategists have shown me those projections. Neither side has the resources to truly conquer the other. We can only bleed each other until one civilization collapses from exhaustion. Not victory or defeat, but transformation. Zalara joined her at the window, her greater height allowing her to look down at the human ambassador. What kind of transformation? Helen turned to face her, and in her eyes Zalara saw the same desperate hope she felt building in her own chest. What if we reframed the entire conflict? Not as a war that one side wins, but as a first contact that went wrong and needs to be reset. What if we announced together that both our peoples made mistakes, that fear drove us to violence, but that we choose a different path now? A joint statement, Zalara said slowly, her mind racing through the implications. Both leaders taking responsibility, both offering peace simultaneously, so neither appears weak. We take the political risk together. If they want to remove us from power, they'll have to remove both of us. And maybe, just maybe, seeing us stand together will inspire others to imagine a different future. It was audacious, It was politically suicidal. It violated every principle of strategic negotiation Zalara had ever learned, and it was the only path she could see that didn't lead to endless death. My generals will call it surrender, Zalara said. My admirals will call it the same, Helen agreed. We could lose everything. We could. Or we could save everything. Zalara looked back at the table where the remains of their simple meal waited. That food, made with care and shared with honesty, had done what years of warfare could not. It had created a moment of genuine understanding between two people who had every reason to hate each other. Let's write it now, Zalara said, before courage fails us, before reality intrudes. They returned to the table, and Helen produced a tablet. They worked through the night, crafting words that would either change the galaxy or end their careers. They argued over phrasing, debated every sentence, but always came back to the core truth. Fear had driven them to war, and only courage could lead them to peace. As dawn broke over the station, they read their final draft. It was simple, direct, and utterly revolutionary. Both leaders acknowledged their mistakes, both committed to a new path, both invited their people to imagine cooperation instead of conquest. This will never work, Zalara said, but she was smiling. Probably not, Helen agreed, matching her smile. But we have to try. They signed the document together, their signatures from two different species marking the same commitment. Then Helen pulled out her communication device. When I send this to my government, there's no going back, she said. When I send it to mine, I expect immediate calls for my execution, Zalara replied. They looked at each other, two women from different worlds who had found common ground over a simple meal, and simultaneously pressed send. The journey back to the Kyrath homeworld felt longer than usual. Zalara spent the time preparing for the confrontation she knew was coming. Her messages were flooded with demands for explanation, with outrage from the military council, with accusations of treason. She ignored them all, focusing instead on the speech she would deliver to her people. She arrived to find the palace in chaos. General Kavros had assembled the war council and half the fleet admirals. They waited for her in the throne room, their crests blazing red with anger. You have betrayed the Empire, Kavros said before she even reached her throne. You have conspired with the enemy, committed to peace without consulting your own military, and undermined 3 centuries of Kyrath expansion. Zalara ascended to her throne slowly, letting the silence build. When she spoke, her voice carried the full harmonic weight of her authority. I have done exactly what needed to be done, and if you had the courage to see beyond your own pride, you would thank me for it. The chamber erupted in shouts, but Zalara raised one clawed hand and the noise died. Centuries of imperial conditioning still held, even in rebellion. Look at our empire, she commanded. Truly look at it. We control 100 worlds, but we're spread so thin that we can barely hold them. Our economy is strained to breaking, our people are exhausted, and every year we lose more ships than we can replace. We're winning battles but losing the war of attrition. Then we need to fight harder, Kavros insisted. We need to crush the humans before they grow stronger. We've been trying that for 5 years, General. How has it worked? We've lost 12,000 ships and counting. We've depleted our resource reserves. And the humans are still there, still fighting, still finding new ways to hurt us. Zalara leaned forward, her eyes meeting each of her counselors in turn. Tell me, how many more of our young must die before you admit that endless conquest is not the same as strength? A younger admiral, Cyrax, spoke up hesitantly. But Majesty, if we make peace now, what was it all for? What did all those deaths mean? They meant we learned a hard lesson, Zalara said, her voice softening. They meant we discovered our limits. And if we're wise, they'll mean we choose a better path so no more must die. She stood, descending from the throne to stand among them as an equal rather than a ruler above. It was a calculated risk, a gesture that stripped away the formal distance of power. I shared a meal with Ambassador Helen Torres. I expected manipulation, tactics, some elaborate human deception. Do you know what I found instead? A mother grieving her son, killed in our war. A woman who chose diplomacy over vengeance because she believes peace is possible. A being not so different from ourselves, trying to protect her people while finding a way to stop the dying." She paused, letting that sink in, and I realized that we've spent so long seeing the humans as enemies that we forgot to see them as people. People who feel loss and fear and hope just as we do. People who could be partners instead of opponents, if we had the courage to try. Kyrath stepped forward, his crest still red but his voice uncertain. "And if this is all manipulation, if the humans use this peace to rebuild and strike us when we're vulnerable, then we fight," Zalara said simply. "But we fight knowing we tried the alternative first. We fight without the weight of wondering if peace was possible." She looked around the chamber at the faces of those who had served her, fought for her, bled for the Empire. She saw anger there, yes, but also exhaustion. They were tired. The whole Empire was tired. "I am your queen," she said. "But I am also Kyrath, and I remember our oldest teachings. We were not always conquerors. Once we were builders, explorers, seekers of knowledge. We can be that again, but only if we choose it. Only if we're brave enough to believe that strength comes from more than domination." The silence stretched. Then Cyrax knelt, a gesture of support that sent shockwaves through the room. Others followed, slowly at first, then faster. Even Kavros, the old warrior, eventually lowered himself, though his crest remained troubled. "We will stand with you, Majesty," Cyrax said. "But the people will need to hear this from you. They'll need to understand why we're changing everything they've known." Zalara nodded. "Then I will tell them. I will broadcast to every world in the Empire, and I will speak the truth. And I will show them something they've never seen before." 3 days later, the broadcast went live across the entire Kyrath Empire and was simultaneously transmitted to human space. Zalara stood not in her throne room, but in a simple chamber, and she was not alone. Helen Torres stood beside her, and between them was a table set for two. The galaxy watched as the Kyrath Queen and the human ambassador shared a traditional Kyrath meal, an act of intimacy that no outsider had ever been permitted. They ate slowly, deliberately, and then they spoke. Zalara told her people about the war's true costs, about the unsustainable path they were on. Helen told her people about the choice between endless conflict and difficult peace. Together, they announced a ceasefire, a summit, a beginning. The response was not unanimous. There were protests, calls for their removal, factions that wanted the war to continue. But there were also celebrations, relief, hope, parents who wouldn't lose children, soldiers who could come home, worlds that could rebuild. 6 months later, Zalara stood in the same human embassy kitchen where it had all begun. Helen was cooking again, teaching her the recipe for the grandmother's stew. Their hands worked side by side, human and Kyrath, preparing food that would feed a delegation of both species. "Do you think it will last?" Helen asked quietly. Zalara considered the question as she stirred the pot, breathing in the familiar smells that had come to mean peace to her. "I don't know. We've made enemies of those who profit from more. There will be challenges, setbacks, moments when it all seems impossible." She looked at Helen, at the friend she'd found in the most unlikely place. "But I know this. Every great change begins with a single choice. We chose to see each other as people instead of enemies. We chose to share a meal instead of exchanging fire, and that choice opened a door that can never be fully closed again." Helen smiled, that same warm expression that had first broken through Zalara's defenses. "My grandmother would have liked you. She always said the best way to make peace is to break bread together." "She was right," Zalara said, "and I think our people are learning that truth. One meal at a time." Outside the embassy, ships from both civilizations moved through space in the first joint patrol, former enemies now protecting the fragile peace they'd built. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was possible, and possibility was everything. Zalara and Helen finished cooking and began setting the table for their guests. As they worked in comfortable silence, Zalara thought about how strange the path had been, how a simple invitation to dinner had changed the course of an empire, how honest conversation over honest food had achieved what weapons could not. The delegates would arrive soon, human and Kyrath together, to negotiate the details of their new alliance. There would be arguments, complications, and compromises, but they would do it over shared meals, breaking bread together, remembering that beneath the scales and skin they were all just people trying to survive and find meaning in a vast indifferent universe. And perhaps, Zalara thought as she placed the last plate on the table, that shared vulnerability was the strongest foundation of all, not conquest, not domination, but the simple courage to sit across from someone different and say, "I see you, I hear you. Let us find a way forward together." The door chimed. The delegates had arrived. Zalara and Helen exchanged one last look, two leaders who had gambled everything on the belief that peace was possible, and together they went to greet the future they'd fought so hard to create. A future built not on the battlefield but around a table, where the simple act of sharing food had proven more powerful than all the weapons in the galaxy combined.